Man, it is. It's a new week. It's a new Sunday, and there's just so much that's happened over the last 7 days. Friday, my family and I we got the chance to go down to San Diego. One of our great friends was having a birthday. She was turning 6, and her wish was to go to San Diego and stay in a hotel with Arlo, my 5-year-old. And I said, "Well, we're going to have some chaperones be a part of this." So we got to go down with some friends and stay down in San Diego. It was windy and rainy and cold, but we didn't let that stop us. And so we had a bonfire on the beach. The rain held off long enough for us to do that. And one of my favorite things since actually a trip to Montana I did with some friends a while back is, and it's hard to explain and it may not sound good to you guys, but to take some steak and to cut it into strips and to put it on skewers and with salt and pepper and just cook it over the fire. It just makes me feel so manly. And it's really tasty as well. So we did that. And I've been expanding my bonfire recipes. So now we cook asparagus just in the fire. I'll wrap it in foil with some olive oil and salt and pepper. Put that in there. We got corn on the cob and covered it in butter because that's what you do with corn on the cob, and Parmesan and garlic and salt. And we wrapped them in aluminum foil and kind of twisted the ends up. And then we threw those into the fire. And it was so much fun. The kids were running around and having a great time. And we just got to be outside. And I've realized halfway through this bonfire that things were cooking and they were doing what they needed to be doing, but I also needed to kind of turn them and rotate them. And I didn't bring any tongs. And so I was like, it's okay, I'm a man, I'm cooking meat over an open fire, I can do this. And so I reach in and everybody's watching, like waiting for me to get burned. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna do this. So I like turn the corn, hold onto the aluminum foil, turn it, and it turns fine. I'm like, oh, it didn't even hurt you guys. And they're like, wow, very impressed with my manliness. And I turn the other corn and I flip the asparagus over. There's one last corn. I go to get the corn and grab it the same exact way that I had with the rest of them and got what has to be like 3rd-degree burns on my fingers. And while I was in pain, everybody else was in laughter. Just thought it was the most funny thing. And I find myself, I didn't get burned the first time, so I just decided, well, let's just try it again. Let's do it again. And so today, I figured since I didn't get burned last week talking about politics, let's try it again and let's see what happens. So it's a really long story to say we're still talking about politics. Our country is still talking about politics. The news is still talking about politics. Saturday Night Live is still talking about politics. Our musicians and our favorite artists and the world around is still talking about politics. There is no way to escape it. And so one of the things that I've realized, and we've been talking about, and as we've been planning for these 2 weeks of this series, is that the reality is that after every election, there is a group of people who are devastated, that are filled with grief because they think the world is over. And there is a group of people that are elated and they are hopeful because they feel like the world is saved. Now, these are 2 very broad and general categories, but the reality is that there continues to be these 2 groups, these 2 kind of sides. We don't say things like, oh, what a shame, my choice didn't make it. We say things like, well, I'm leaving the country. I won't ask you to raise your hand if you've said that, or if you've thought that, or maybe you've heard other people say that. We say things like, well, they should probably just split the country into 2. This is the way we respond. This is the sense of kind of utter desperation. And it may not be totally serious, but it's also probably not totally a joke. There is just a very real sense of frustration. This is kind of what we've become used to. This is what we're familiar with. But what if both sides are wrong? What if both groups are wrong? These 2 political ideologies, and we're simplifying it again, but they could not be on further ends of the spectrum. But oftentimes, the thing that we have most in common is that we've decided to allow a public election to determine our amount of personal peace. We allow this political time, this political season, a politician or a party to determine whether they lose or win. That is what determines how much peace we have. And this is an issue. None of us are exempt from this. I've felt this in my own heart, in my own mind. You've felt this. We've all had this to varying degrees at different times. And the reality is that people have always been tempted to believe that the right political power or party or person will fix the problems in their life and will fix the country, it'll fix the relationships. And so today, regardless of whether you feel like you are on the winning side or the losing side, or if you are this beautiful unicorn of bipartisan love and unity, blessings to you. Wherever you feel like you may be, there is a reality that we as Christians and as Jesus followers, we are called to not put our trust in a political power or a winner or a loser in this sense, but there's something bigger going on. There's a Savior that is different than that. And so, as if talking about politics isn't quite risky enough, we also decided that today I'm going to teach on a passage about taxes. Mark 12, it's not totally about taxes, but it is. You'll see, we'll get there. Mark chapter 12, I'm going to read the whole story, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit. But it says this in verse 13, "Later, they sent some of the Pharisees and the Herodians to Jesus to catch him in his words." Now, the Pharisees were familiar with them. They're religious leaders. And while they would sometimes use the political power of the day, they were not fans of the political power. They hated Rome, and they would leverage it to try and get rid of Jesus, but they really hated being occupied. They hated the fact that they were limited in their worship opportunities and all these different things. The Herodians were Jewish people that loved Rome, and so these are very much two different political parties that come, and it says they come to catch Jesus in his words. So they come to him and they say, "Teacher, we know that you are a man of integrity." I feel like we just sang something like that. "We know you are a man of integrity, and you aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are, but you teach the way of God in accordance to the truth. So is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we?" We'll stop there for just a second. They say, "We know that you are not easily swayed. We know we have not been able to get you to pick a side. We know that you teach the scripture, you're a man of integrity. And so even though we've never been able to get you to pick a side, we have a question." You know, there's this sense of like, I bet they all feel kind of like, oh, we're going to find out. Who is he for? Is he for Israel or is he for Rome? Is he for religious freedom or is he for political power? Where is he going to fall? And there's this sense where they ask him this question: is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we? It goes on, it says, "But Jesus knew their hypocrisy, and he says, 'Why are you trying to trap me?' he asked. 'Bring me a denarius and let me look at it.' So they brought the coin, and he asked them, 'Whose image is this, and whose inscription?' 'Caesar's,' they replied. And then Jesus said to them, 'Well, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God, or what is God's.' And then the story ends, and it says, 'And they were amazed at him.'" They started off trying to trap him, and they ended being amazed. There's so much that happens in this passage, and I've spent hours and hours trying to figure out what to whittle down because I don't want to be preaching all day. There's so much happening in here. There's so much kind of underlying nuance because of what was happening at the time. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the history and some of the context of this passage, but then also the spiritual implications. 2,000 years ago, things were incredibly different than they are today. But people still were incredibly passionate about their perspective on the government, and people had to pay taxes. A lot of them. There's a lot of historians have written about how in some of these areas, the people were actually taxed almost 80% of what they made. There was a lot of taxes. So this Pharisee and the Herodian, or a group of each of them, they come to Jesus with a question on politics and taxes. The reality is that this tax, it wasn't a tax on goods. It wasn't a tax on business. It was what's called like a head tax. Essentially, this was a tax that the Caesar kind of put on people for the privilege of being a subject of Caesar. You're welcome. Now give me a denarius. It's like 1 denarius a year. This was a tax that was different than all of the other taxes. Now, 25 years before this, when this tax was first instituted, there was an armed revolt that happened. When Caesar first instituted this head tax, there was a man named Judas of Galilee, not to be confused with the other Judas that many of us are familiar, the disciple. Judas of Galilee, he was this Jewish kind of zealot that led this revolt. And he said, no, we are not paying a head tax. We're not doing this. And he had this armed uprising and he was killed. And so there is this sense where people have been aware of this tax. The Jewish people hated this tax. It wasn't even that much. A denarius was about 1 day's wage for like the lowest economic class. So it's not even that much money to pay this once a year. It's not even like it's an oppressive tax. But there was something about it that just grinded against who they wanted to be. The fact that they had to live in this system with this Caesar, that they had to pay this money to be a part of this system was frustrating to them. This is what they're pushing against. So they're really laying kind of a lose-lose situation for Jesus, because if he says, no, don't pay the tax, then he's essentially calling for a revolt against Rome. If he says, yeah, absolutely, don't pay that, then he is saying, we are going to revolt against the political power of the day. And if he says, yes, pay the tax, then what he's essentially doing is he's kind of diminishing everything he has said about the kingdom of God. And everyone who's heard him teach these messages and talk about these things will start to lose faith in the reality of a different kingdom that is being brought in. And so they ask him this question: should we pay this tax or not? Yes or no, black or white. And when politicians find themselves with a question that's that clear, they usually just don't answer it at all. And Jesus, always willing to poke the fire just a few more times to see how much more he can push people. Jesus refuses political simplicity, political complacency, and political primacy. Now, these are 3 different phrases and 3 different kind of concepts. We're going to look at briefly each one of these things, but they ask him this question, and in his response, he refuses to simplify things, to be complacent, or to make politics the primary thing in his response and the way that he handles it. So the first thing is that he refuses or rejects political simplicity. They say, should we or shouldn't we? Yes or no, one side or the other side. Are you for us or against us? Are you for Rome or are you against Rome? And Jesus sees what they're doing, and he essentially says, you don't actually want to know what God thinks. You want me to rubber stamp what you've already decided you want. That's the question that they're asking. They're saying, Jesus, tell us which one of us is right. They're not saying, Jesus, tell us what is right. They're saying, here's your choices. We need you to approve one of them. We need your okay on one of these. We need you to take a stand on one of these things. And for us, if Jesus happens to agree with all of our political opinions, we are probably not following Jesus. We're probably asking Jesus to follow us. And there's a reality for us where we have to start to wrestle with, and again, and I'm going to use basic generalized language that maybe not everybody likes, but if you feel like your party won or your party lost, we have still, regardless of which side you may feel like you're on, we have got to start to recognize that if Jesus agrees with all of our political opinions, then we're probably not following Jesus, because Jesus was somehow able to speak for and against every side that there was. Every argument. He somehow found his way through the middle of it. They want a clear answer, and Jesus won't do it. So what are the implications for us about political simplicity, refusing to be a part of that? We cannot do to Jesus what he would not do to himself. We cannot put Jesus in a political party or in a political bubble when he refused to be put in one himself. We cannot say, well, this is the party of Jesus and that is not, or this is the party of Jesus and that is not. We cannot do that because he would never tie himself to one political or governmental or power structure over another. He did not come to take sides, he came to take over. He came to bring in an entirely new reality, a new system, a new way of existing, because whichever side you felt like you were on, it was still grabbing at power. Somehow Jesus comes in and subverts all of that. So he rejected political simplicity. He wouldn't boil it down to a yes or no thing, and we've got to be able to navigate that in our own hearts and in our own minds. Just because the election is over doesn't mean that we get to check out. We've got to still engage. He also rejected political complacency. So in the story, it says he asks for a denarius. This was super common. This coin, you can actually see him in most museums. They're everywhere. Like I said, they weren't worth very much, but every one of them, when he asks for the coin and he has them come forward and he asks whose face is on this and whose inscription, and it's Caesar's face, and the inscription on the coin says, Tiberius Caesar, son of the god Augustus and high priest, which is bold claims. We're familiar with those being generally things we say about Jesus. And so you see there's already some challenge here. He's not complacent because he is who we believe Jesus to be, really does push up against political power of that day and of our day here still. He says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. The King James says render. I know you guys prefer the King James version of the Bible. The NIV says give to Caesar. He says render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. So whose image is on this, he says? They say it's Caesar's. It's Caesar's face on it. So then does he say, okay, well then just pay taxes? No. He says, well, how dare you put this idolatrous coin in my hand? No, he doesn't move one side or another. He says, well, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. The literal translation, every version of the Bible kind of translates this phrase a little bit differently. And the literal, the most accurate translation, as I've been reading and studying this week, and I don't figure these things out on my own. I read very smart people that have spent decades studying these languages. They say the most accurate translation would be something more like, well, give Caesar what he deserves, which is somehow clear and ambiguous at the same time. Give Caesar what he deserves. Well, depending on your seat, you probably think he deserves something different. Depending on how rich or wealthy or powerful or broken or oppressed or taxed or put out of your worship or your home, depending on your seat, you probably think Caesar deserves various things. And that is just not that different from where we are at today. Jesus says, give Caesar what he deserves. Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, which is both clear and ambiguous. It was Caesar's coin. It had his face on it. Also, it literally was his money. The coins were minted out of his personal wealth. It wasn't the government's money. It was literally the emperor's money. So he says, give to Caesar the things that are his. But it also implies we don't necessarily give him free reign. We don't necessarily give him blind allegiance. We give Caesar what he deserves. And we have to navigate that. It's not a complacency. It's an invitation into complexity, which never really works well in a two-party political system. Complexity and nuance are not things that we like. It's like a all in or all out type of situation. We cannot be party people. We have to be kingdom people. And when forced to choose between the lesser of two evils, as I've heard so many people say about this recent election, when we're forced to choose between the lesser of two evils, we still have to be honest about the evils. We can't just say, well, this one's a lesser evil, so I'm just going to accept all of it. When we're forced to choose between imperfect platforms, we still are called to point out the flaws and the imperfections in the platforms. We are called to live a complex, to not be complacent, but to lean in and say, I'm not going to be complacent. I'm not just going to be uncaring. I'm going to look at this and I'm going to say, okay, whose kingdom physically do I live in, and what does it mean for me to exist in that kingdom? And also, what does it mean for me to be aware, to use my mind, to use my power, to use my words, to engage and to give Caesar what he deserves? Jesus was opposing two groups, really, when he said to pay the taxes. And again, more history. You're welcome, everybody. There's a group called the Essenes, which most people haven't heard of, because they wanted nothing to do with the Roman government, and they said, we're not going to do it. And they all got up, and they took their scriptures, and they moved out to the desert, and they died. That's not a joke, but that's what happened. We're familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those were scrolls that the Essenes, when they left political society, they took them with them, and the scrolls are what was left. They left, they checked out of the system. They dropped out of culture because they refused to engage. They refused to pay the taxes. They refused to be a part of the system that they lived in. And Jesus does not want us to opt out of the system. He does not want us to be politically complacent and to just remove ourselves. He's saying, no, you need to figure out how to give Caesar what is Caesar's, and also how do you push back and fight for what is right, what you believe. So he opposes the political complacency. The second group that he was kind of pushing back against was the Zealots. The Zealots are exactly what they sounded like. They wanted to revolt. Jesus clearly isn't going in that direction, but the Zealots at that time, they expected Jesus to not only be a spiritual Messiah, but a political Messiah, which is the whole thing. When Jesus rides into town on a donkey and everybody is singing songs, it's because they thought he was coming in to overthrow Rome, to overthrow the government. And so Jesus is pushing back against the people that says, hey, you know what? We're not going to do anything about this. We're not even going to think about politics. We're not going to talk about politics. We're just going to get out of the system altogether. He says, no, we cannot be politically complacent. And also, we cannot believe that politics are primary. He pushes back against the people that say the only way we find freedom, the only way we're saved is through government, through politics, through Rome, through Caesar, through a political Messiah, not just a spiritual Messiah. Jesus is pushing back against all of these things. And this is the beauty of what Jesus was able to do. And it is so hard for us to be like Christ in these ways, because we have so many feelings and opinions and experiences, and every voice outside of us, outside of our own head, is saying, you have got to accept the entire package of this party or the entire package of this party. And we are called to somehow navigate these things and say, I'm not going to be politically simple. I'm not going to simplify things. I'm not going to break things down to a yes or no, all in or all out. We can't be complacent, and we also can't believe that it's primary. In the narrow sense of who Jesus was, he was not political. He didn't pick a political party. But in the broad sense, Jesus was incredibly political. He didn't say, I'm for Rome or I'm against Rome. He didn't say, I'm Republican or I'm Democrat, I'm for this candidate or I'm for that candidate. But he spoke in broad terms. Everything that he said had to do with justice and bringing in relief for the suffering and fighting for the hungry and pushing against poverty and healing brokenness. I think one of the most beautiful and poetic parts of this exchange in Mark is when Jesus says, bring me a denarius. They say, Jesus, should we pay this tax or not? And this tiny coin that almost everybody would have, Jesus is like, can somebody bring me one? My robe doesn't have pockets. No, none of the women would have been able to live in a robe with no pockets. But he doesn't even have a coin. This symbol of wealth, this symbol of power, this symbol of who was in charge. Our king didn't even have a quarter on him. And they bring it to him, and he says, whose picture is on this? And the Greek word is whose icon. We've heard of this word before. It says, whose image is on this? And they say, well, it's Caesar's. He says, well, if it's got his image on it, then give it to him. And then I think what he's implying is, and if it has God's image on it, give it to God. So yeah, give Caesar the coin. Exist in this system that you live in. Figure out how to navigate the complexities of this reality. It is not all for you all the time. It is difficult and challenging and frustrating. But let's remember, the coin has Caesar's face on it. And you and I and you watching at home and you in the room, we bear the image of God. We belong to a different king and a different kingdom. And as much as that coin literally belonged to Caesar, we belong to a heavenly Father and we bear his image. And we have got to begin to understand what that means. We've got to begin to embrace this reality for ourselves and for each other. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, the coin, the tax, the piece of society that you live in, whether you chose it or whether someone chose for you. And if it has his image on it, give it to him. It belongs to him, it's his. And give to God what is God's, what has his image on it. This exchange is about ownership and authority. Jesus is saying, you want me to tell you that you can break the rules you don't like. And I think ultimately he wants us to honor the authority that we disagree with and recognize that we're a part of a different kingdom, that there is a greater power. This small coin, this small expectation, this requirement, this policy that you don't like, that you have blown into the biggest thing, let them have it. But more importantly, remember whose mark you carry. Remember what kingdom you are a part of. And most of us reverse this. And both sides have reversed this. I have reversed this. We get this backwards and we think, you know what? God can have this little thing and I'm going to make sure that the political power is able to fix all the real problems that I'm wrestling with on a day-to-day basis. God can have the hour and a half on a Sunday but with the rest of my energy, I'm going to make sure that the politics work out the way that I want it to be. I'm going to figure out how can I cautiously and in a non-awkward or non-offensive way, I'm going to figure out how I can invite someone to church with me, which I love and go to every week, but I'm going to just spout off whatever kind of nonsense and rhetoric and hateful, mean, cruel, judgmental things to make sure everybody knows the right political side that they should be on. The difference of what we tend to do is insane because we bear the image of God. We are literally representing a different kingdom. So it's not about simplifying it. It's not about being complacent. And it's not about being primarily political. We have always wanted a political Messiah, but what we need is a spiritual Messiah. It's easy to put trust in the government because it seems like they have the power to fix things. We've all been tempted to believe that the things that we are desperate for, our hope, joy, peace can be found in the right leaders, the right government, the right president, the right whatever it might be. And I think another way to say it is that we believe blessed are the powerful because the problems are over. We tend to buy into this reality, this kind of backwards concept of blessed are the powerful because they won't have problems. They can fix the old problems. They can pay for things to get resolved. They can institute changes. And so we think blessed are the power. The power is where the hope is. But Jesus, the Son of God, our high priest, says something very different. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And this is the sermon that he preached to people that were begging for a different political power. The people on the hill where Jesus preached this sermon wanted nothing more than for their own preference to be embraced by the government. They wanted nothing more. And I think oftentimes we're like, well, I hunger and thirst for righteousness. That's why I lean into politics. That's why I want to make things, I want to see things change. But the question is, do we go about it in a way that is pure in heart and merciful and peacemaking and humble and acknowledges the sovereignty of God? Are we more infatuated with the Ten Commandments or the Beatitudes? With what Moses said, this is God's perspective for how we should live, or for what Jesus said, this is who is blessed. This is what my kingdom looks like. Do we acknowledge the sovereignty of God? In Colossians chapter 1, it's a beautiful passage. I'm going to wrap it up here in a minute. I have no idea what time it is. Okay, that's what time it is. Go eat popcorn. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. You guys, I'll teach you whatever you want to know about the Bible. Colossians chapter 1, starting in verse 15. Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. He existed before anything was created and is supreme over all creation. For through him God created everything in the heavenly realms and on earth. He made the things we can see and the things we can't see, such as thrones and kingdoms, rulers and authorities. Everything was created through him and for him. He existed before anything else, and he holds all creation together. Christ is also the head of the church, which is his body. He is the beginning, supreme over all who rise from the dead. So he is first in everything. For God, in all his fullness, was pleased to live in Christ. And through him, God reconciled everything to himself. He made peace with everything in heaven and on earth by means of Christ's blood on the cross. That is literally the hope that we have. Not politically, not metaphorically, not like in a perfect situation. Like that is the hope that we have. And I think I, and maybe some of you, have forgotten that this hope has been changing lives and outlasting every nation and every kingdom and every ruler and every emperor and every president. And it doesn't mean that we are complacent. It doesn't mean that we simplify it. It means that we have got to remember that when we show up bearing the image of our God. And we are called to love each other and recognize that peace was made through his blood shed on a cross, through his sacrifice, through giving of himself. And that is what we are called to emulate. There's a story I read a couple weeks ago, and it was kind of crazy. And I've been thinking about it a lot over the last few weeks. It says in 1865, not long after the Civil War, the members of St. Paul's Church in Richmond, Virginia, gathered for worship. Among them were many leaders of the defeated Confederacy. When the time came for communion, the first person to walk towards the table was a tall black man. The Richmond Times-Dispatch, the newspaper that this article was pulled from in that time in 1865, says this was a great surprise and shock. A witness reported its effect upon the communicants was startling, and for several moments they retained their seats in solemn silence and did not move, being deeply chagrined at this attempt to inaugurate the new regime. They felt that they were trying to offend and humiliate them during their most devoted church services. The minister refused to give this black man the communion elements, but the man refused to leave the table. The stalemate was finally broken when General Robert E. Lee, in his usual dignified and self-possessed manner, approached the table and received the communion elements, ignoring the black man altogether. And the rest of the church followed his example. The newspaper reported, by this action of General Lee, the services were conducted as if the man had not been present. It was a grand exhibition of superiority shown by a true Christian and a great soldier under the most trying and offensive circumstances. General Lee himself called the man's act provoking and irritating. That is the table that we are invited to. A provoking and irritating table. One that seats Republicans and Democrats and independents and libertarians. A table that seats white people and black people and Hispanic people and every nation and every tongue. A table that seats people that have absolutely destroyed their life and maybe destroyed other people's lives. A table that seats people that have lived good lives. A table that has rich and poor. The table of Christ, the Eucharist, the coming together around the table is irritating because we want things to be our way. It makes sense when it's our way, but it is not our table. It's not our church. We are not our own. We bear the image of our Maker. We bear God's image.